Okay, so I intended my next video to be about the Roman Empire, and specifically about how Augustus failing to create a manner of succession is the main reason that it collapsed. But while I was writing that, a movie came out, and it got a whole lot of historians super angry and all stirred up, and there was discourse and takes, and honestly, I felt like I needed to say something. Not because I really have anything to add on, like, the takes that you've probably already seen. I want to talk about something completely different. For those of you unknown to what I'm talking about, that movie was Napoleon. And like Waterloo before it, it wasn't exactly a hit. It's certainly not likely to be culturally relevant in the same way that something like, I don't know, Les Mis is. And I can already imagine that some people are going to bristle at that because Les Mis is not a biographical movie. It isn't history. It's historical fiction. And you wouldn't be wrong. But my point in bringing it up is that the questions that are going to be asked about Napoleon as a movie and about Napoleon as history have as much in common as Napoleon and Les Mis do. You are talking about functionally different things, about different people and different intentions. And more importantly, you're kind of exposing what I believe is the core problem in the modern study of history, and really the modern problem with modern communication done by technocratic people everywhere. Because the questions about Napoleon, about making movies, are roughly the same as the modern question of misinformation, about alternative facts, and what exactly is the purpose of the truth, as well as what exactly is true in the first place. Now, we who have been brought up in modern Western education are likely going to say that this doesn't make any sense, because the truth isn't absolute, right? Scientists, for example, will claim that things that they can prove are true. And yet lots of things in science boil down to things that are either unprovable or not fully understood. The world of science thought it understood what caused diseases until it discovered germs. It thought it understood math until calculus was discovered. It thinks lots of things are true until they turn out not to be true. But history isn't science. History is, supposedly, the study of the past, and modern historians like to see themselves as stewards of the truth. They see themselves much like a technocrat does when making public policy, someone who pores over facts and data and says what is true and what happened. But this manner of history is, intentionally so, entirely counter to the way human beings remember things and learn things. The questions around Napoleon, namely the lament by historians that it spreads incorrect information, reveals, in my mind, a failing of the entire historical field and a failing of modern communications. Because human beings don't think about facts. We do not naturally know if something that has been told to us is true or false. When we are told something, we often think about whether or not this thing feels true, and we go from there. Okay, historians lament this as a problem of human nature, the same way that scientists lament how quickly, say, anti-vaccine views spread among the population. So to answer all of this, to really talk about this problem and why everybody is talking around themselves, we have to really start with one question in particular. What is the purpose of history? And perhaps then we need to ask, what is history? Now, modern historians would probably tell you that it's a retelling of data, of events, people, places, and things. That they take data and they quantify it to tell you what is true. And that's both an academic way to look at it, and it's entirely different from what the word history actually represents. Now, the beginning of what we call the historical tradition in the Western world starts with a man known as Herodotus. Now, he's usually referred to in one of two ways. He's either the father of history or he's the father of lies. Now, he's referred to the father of history because he is, as far as we know, either the first person to recount history in a certain way or the first person that we have a source for. Before him, history was primarily done in annals, meaning line by line accounts of events. The ancient Egyptians, in particular, this was how they recorded all of their history. Dates telling you what happened and where were the only way in which history was recorded. But Herodotus did more than this. He told stories. To him, recounting history was the recounting of more than just facts. He would tell you what he had heard about places he had never been from people who may or may not have been reputable. Much of what he recounted as history, as the truth, was in fact entirely untrue, which is how he got the moniker the father of lies. However, I think saying that he lied is a bit unfair, because to lie is to say something that you know is untrue and present it as being true. If you present something as truth that you believe is true, or you present something someone else said when they believe it is true, you haven't lied. Because to lie, you'd have to either A, know it was false, or B, believe it was false. Recounting something as the truth that you believe is true, but is actually untrue, is not lying. It doesn't make you a liar. It makes you wrong. And these are different things, because for much of history, writing what you believed to be true was the same thing as recounting what was actually true. In many places and many times, it was perfectly acceptable to put words in the mouths of people who never said them, so long as what you were saying was in the same spirit as what they probably said. So what happened, starting with Herodotus, is that the recounting of history stopped being about simply recounting events as things that happened. They took their inspiration from mythology and collective history, which was primarily the domain of storytellers. Because before history was ever written down, it was told and retold orally. In fact, one could argue that oral history is still more common today than written history, simply because much of what we as people learn about ourselves, where we live, our identity, our past, and our ancestors, all comes from oral retellings of those around us. Now, at the time of recording this, it's just after Christmas and New Year's, and I bring that up because holidays bring families together, and families tell stories. Everyone, I think, can likely tell stories that were told to them about other members of their family, which may or may not be true, because we have no way of verifying them. So, to give you an example, in my own history an example, my grandmother would tell stories about her mother. And in one case, she told us about how my great-grandmother had to hide in a pickle barrel when the Cossacks of Russia would come through and raid, because they would stab through the mattresses to see if anyone was under them. Now, is that story true? Did my great-grandmother actually hide in a pickle barrel when Cossacks raided her village in Russia? I don't know. I can't know. It's not the sort of event that exists in written records. All I have is a story from my grandmother who was told it by her own mother. Now, does that make it true? We could assume for a moment that someone is lying or exaggerating or deliberately changing events. We could assume that things shifted over time, that memories became hazy with age, and that tellings changed from individual to individual. But understand that what you're doing right now when you ask yourself if you believe it is not comparing facts. What you're doing is asking whether or not this feels true based on entirely different sets of information. Now, chances are you do this all the time with everybody that you know. I mean, how many times has someone said that something happened, only for you to get an entirely different story from someone else? The question that is asked is not, what do the facts say, but whose facts do you believe to be the truth? Much of history is the same way. The question is, what sources do you believe? And if you don't believe them, why? Much of what you know, or think you know, has been tinted, or as some would say, tainted, simply because the person retelling events has an unconscious bias. Or maybe the words that are being used do not mean what they meant before, and how we understand them is fundamentally wrong. So one example of this comes from how we talk about absolutism in European monarchy. Now, today, an absolute monarch conveys the idea of absolute power and absolute authority. In other words, it refers to someone whose power is unlimited in nature. But this isn't what the word meant hundreds of years ago, because while a monarch might have had absolute power over everything from taxation to the laws of the land, things that often depended on his whims, this didn't mean that he had absolute or unlimited authority. The very idea of the divine right of kings undermines our modern idea of the word, because if the rights come from God, then the authority rests with God, not the king in question. Our modern conception of absolute monarchs as absolute despots comes from historians writing in the 1800s during the time of upheavals where monarchies were mostly unstable, and in many cases, in democracies who actively wanted the monarchies to disappear. You had secular, educated elites across Europe who wrote and distributed the ideas that we would come to parrot today, ideas of absolute monarchs being absolute despots, despite the fact that the term absolute monarch does not in fact refer to the unlimited power that we now associate with it. The same is true with words like democracy. So today, democracy refers to a system of government where authority and legitimacy are conveyed through the acceptance of popular majorities. But when men like Aristotle and Plato wrote about governments and used the word democracy, they were using it the same way we would today use the word anarchy. In other words, what you know often comes down to who's telling the story. Indeed, historians, by recounting events, often do so by accepting the stories of previous historians, the same way storytellers retelling a story might copy what they were told in the past. Now, this in many ways goes against the modern ideal of the historian as it's taught in colleges and universities, that the historian must be as unbiased as possible, ignoring the fact that the very concept of being unbiased is itself a bias. To accept or reject information is to express a bias, and we are not immune to this, even if we wish to be. But why am I telling you all of this? What's the point of this entire discussion? What I want you, the listener, to take away from this is that we live in an age where historians are turning further and further away from the job of storyteller and towards the job of recorder. To remove the idea of bias, they remove as much as they can until what they are left with are the facts, which to them means the truth. But you see, this is not without consequences. And this is where our discussion of movies, media, modern communication, and misinformation come from. Because human beings, as I said before, are not fact-based creatures. We do not intuit naturally what is true and what is false based on facts, sources, or bibliographies. We learn and we listen to the best storytellers, and often these are the ones that appeal to our own interests. Now, chances are, if you're listening to me right now, you are probably interested in long-form, academic-sounding discussions of complex topics. You are entirely different from the person who listens to things on TikTok, the person who primarily consumes things in short-form, quickly explained direct videos. Both of these groups are entirely different from someone who might prefer historical movies, whose retelling of events can be influenced by everything from what era it's recorded in and what era it's written in to who is playing what character. So what am I getting at? What's my point for all of this? What I'm driving at is that at the same time that information has become more plentiful, the people who claim to be the ones telling the truth have almost entirely abdicated the role of storyteller. Now, as a result, the things which will be passed on are the same things that were always passed on since the beginning of human history, which are the stories that we personally believe. Now, we today live in an age where people worry about misinformation, as though there is ever a time in history where misinformation didn't exist. But this worry that people will do harmful things based on incorrect information is in fact valid. But what they don't do is take the blame for this themselves. What they do is blame the people who believe incorrect information as though they themselves are perfectly able to discern what is true. Now, the truth is, people are sucked into worlds of incorrect information for the same reason that people buy into propaganda. A story that they want to hear is being told. And no one has ever changed their mind by being told that they're wrong and then read a list of alternative information. Fact-checking might feel good to the one who's doing it, but it does nothing to address the problem, because you have not replaced the story you don't like with anything new. So, let's return to Napoleon. It's a movie, and has plenty of factual inaccuracies, and these will be picked over, but none of that actually matters. Nothing anyone says about the facts of the movie will ever matter. What will matter is how those facts are told to the audience that watches or listens to them. There's a reason why people will say, this is the true story of something, even if it's not true. It's because the goal is to replace what someone knows with something new. More accurately, it's to replace an old story with a new story. Now, Napoleon as a movie can be dissected by film critics and audiences. The question of whether or not it's historically accurate or whether or not that matters is something entirely removed from the matter of how good the film is. Indeed, I think that the real question is, how much does the film influence how people think about these topics? In America, for example, many people's idea of what the American West was like during the 1800s was informed by Hollywood's Wild West movie boom. But here's the thing. Almost no one today would say that their picture of the Wild West looks like a John Wayne movie. And the reason for that is that since that boom, there have been all kinds of stories told about that period that inform how we look at it. Many people's idea of what the West looks like now probably looks a lot more like Red Dead Redemption as opposed to The Searchers. And so thus we have both our problem and our solution to the questions that Napoleon as a movie presents to us. If the issue you have is that you think that Napoleon inspires bad knowledge, then it's up to you to tell the story you think needs to be told better than they did it. It can be done. For example, there are many channels and podcasts that do exactly that. Millions of people, for example, have learned about Napoleon from oversimplified videos about his era in history. One could even say that more people have seen his videos than saw the Napoleon movie. In other words, the way in which you confront and combat bad history is by being a better storyteller. Most people do in fact like learning new things, but they dislike memorizing things. If you present information in a way that makes it easy to retell, people will do exactly that on their own. That's the very nature of how rumors and hearsay are created. Things are told and retold and are repeated as though they are true, regardless as to whether or not they actually are. The supposed crisis in information accuracy is not a crisis for the consumer, but for the people who consider themselves arbiters of what is true. Because having removed themselves from the roles of storyteller, they are surprised to find out that stories fill the gaps that they have left, as stories will always do. A story is much easier to remember and retell than a set of facts. The questions that the movie Napoleon makes us ask tell us more about what we value and who we are than anything else. The same problem that historians are having is being had in medicine, in politics, in environmentalism, and many more places. You cannot inform a population with facts alone, because people do not remember facts alone. If you want to spread truth, if you want to inform people, then you need to tell a story that they will both remember and then want to retell. In fact, it's really not as hard as it might sound. We tell ourselves all manner of stories, as I said before. Who you are, where you come from, what you've done, what you want to do. All of these things are stories. How you tell that story and what parts you choose to highlight and bring attention to, and who you tell that story to, all influences what people think of as the truth regarding you. This approach is universal. Historians then simply need to remember where they came from, and stop trying to run away from their own history if they want to combat what they see as bad history. What they really need to do is learn how to tell stories again so that they can better inform the public.